The Bismarck wasn't only a military weapon, it was also a status symbol, indicating the regaining of German sea power, also a symbol for German technological achievements.
For 21 years, HMS Hood was the most famous warship on Earth. She was the pride of the Royal Navy, a floating symbol of British power, and a ship so recognizable that even people who had never seen the ocean knew her name. Postcards carried her image. Crowds gathered whenever she entered port. Foreign admirals studied her. British schoolboys collected photographs of her, and sailors simply called her the Mighty Hood. Then, on the morning of May 24, 1941, she vanished in less than 3 minutes. There were 1,421 men aboard. Only 3 survived. But the speed of Hood's destruction is not the most unsettling part of this story. The Royal Navy had known for years that she carried a potentially fatal weakness. Plans existed to correct it. Engineers understood the danger. Yet when Hood finally met the German battleship Bismarck in the freezing waters of the Denmark Strait, that work had still not been done. And decades later, when explorers finally located her remains nearly 2 miles beneath the Atlantic, they found something far more violent than an ordinary shipwreck. Hood had not simply sunk. She had been torn apart from the inside. I previously told this battle from the German side, through the story of Bismarck. This is the other half of that encounter, the story of the ship Britain believed could not be lost, the men sent to stop Germany's most dangerous battleship, and the design compromise that may have doomed them before the first shot was fired. HMS Hood was laid down in 1916, during the final years of the First World War. She was designed in an era when naval planners were obsessed with speed, firepower, and the possibility of another enormous fleet battle like Jutland. Hood was classified as a battle cruiser. In simple terms, she carried guns powerful enough to fight a battleship, but she relied on greater speed rather than the same level of armor protection. The idea was straightforward. She could destroy anything fast enough to catch her and outrun anything powerful enough to destroy her. At least, that was the theory. When commissioned in 1920, Hood was an extraordinary machine. She measured approximately 860 feet from bow to stern, displaced more than 47,000 tons at full load, and carried 8 massive 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. Each of those guns could fire a shell weighing nearly a ton over distances measured in miles. To the public, Hood looked invincible. She was long, fast, heavily armed, and more graceful than the broad, compact battleships of her era. Her appearance alone helped create the legend. She did not look like an aging warship from the First World War. She looked modern, powerful, and almost impossibly large. For much of the period between the wars, Hood served as Britain's most visible naval ambassador. She traveled around the world, visiting ports across Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Americas. Wherever she went, people came to see her. During the Empire cruise of the 1920s, Hood and the other ships traveling with her were greeted by enormous crowds. To many observers, she represented more than the Royal Navy. She represented the remaining reach of the British Empire itself. She became one of the most photographed ships ever built. But beneath that reputation was a weakness that never went away. Hood's protection had been designed according to lessons learned during the First World War. Her side armor was substantial, intended to resist shells traveling on relatively flat trajectories at shorter combat ranges. However, naval gunnery was changing. As guns became more accurate and engagements occurred at longer distances, shells no longer traveled primarily sideways into a ship's armored belt. At extreme range, they climbed high into the air before descending at a steep angle. This was known as plunging fire. Instead of striking the heavily armored side of the ship, a plunging shell could come down through the deck, where Hood's armor was significantly thinner. Royal Navy officers understood the danger. Modernization plans were proposed throughout the 1930s. Hood was supposed to receive improved deck armor, new machinery, updated fire control equipment, stronger anti-aircraft defenses, and other major changes. But the refit would have required removing one of Britain's most important capital ships from service for well over a year. And there was always another crisis. Tensions were rising in Europe. The Royal Navy was stretched across the world. Italy was expanding its navy. Japan was growing more aggressive in Asia. Germany was rebuilding its fleet. Hood was needed at sea, so the refit was repeatedly delayed. By the time the Second World War began, the most famous ship in the Royal Navy was operating with machinery, protection, and internal systems that had largely been designed more than 2 decades earlier. Her reputation belonged to the modern world. Much of her construction did not. Then, in May 1941, Germany sent Bismarck into the Atlantic. Bismarck was new, heavily armoured, powerfully armed, and accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Their mission was to break into the shipping lanes and attack the convoys keeping Britain supplied. If Bismarck reached the open Atlantic, she could force the Royal Navy to divert enormous resources to finding her. Even the threat of her presence could disrupt merchant traffic. Britain had to stop her before she disappeared. Hood was ordered to sea alongside HMS Prince of Wales, a new battleship that was so recently completed that civilian shipyard workers were reportedly still aboard, correcting mechanical problems during the mission. The contrast between the 2 British ships was striking. Hood was famous, experienced, and aging. Prince of Wales was modern, powerful, and not yet fully ready. Together, they sailed north to intercept the German force in the Denmark Strait, the cold passage between Greenland and Iceland. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland commanded the British squadron from Hood. He understood the danger posed by long-range fire against Hood's deck armour. His plan appears to have been to close the distance quickly, reducing the angle at which German shells would fall and bringing Hood's powerful forward guns into action. But approaching the enemy head-on created another problem. For much of the approach, Hood and Prince of Wales could use only their forward turrets. The German ships, crossing their path, could bring a larger number of guns to bear. At 5:52 in the morning on May 24th, the British opened fire. Almost immediately, something went wrong. Hood initially targeted Prince Eugen, apparently mistaking her for Bismarck. Prince of Wales correctly engaged the German battleship. The Germans returned fire within minutes. Shells began falling around Hood, throwing enormous towers of water into the air. The ships were moving at high speed through rough northern seas, while gunnery teams on both sides attempted to calculate distance, speed, direction, and timing. Then Hood was hit. A shell from Prince Eugen appears to have started a fire near the base of Hood's mainmast. Flames spread among ammunition or ready-use stores on the upper deck. From the nearby ships, sailors could see the fire burning. But Hood continued forward. The larger danger was still coming. At approximately 6 o'clock, Holland ordered a turn that would allow Hood's rear turrets to join the battle. It was a critical moment. Once the turn was completed, all 8 of Hood's 15-inch guns could fire. She never completed it. A German salvo came down around the British ship. One shell, widely believed to have been fired by Bismarck, struck somewhere near Hood's aft section. What happened next lasted only seconds. Witnesses described a flash, followed by a narrow jet or column of flame rising near the mainmast. Then came an explosion so enormous that it appeared to lift sections of the ship out of the water. Hood broke apart. The most widely accepted explanation is that the shell penetrated into the ship and triggered one of the aft ammunition magazines. Inside those magazines were large quantities of shells and cordite propellant intended for Hood's main guns. When that material detonated, the explosion did not remain contained. It ripped through the ship. The stern disappeared beneath the surface almost immediately. The bow rose steeply from the water, remained visible for a short time, and then sank as well. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. Prince of Wales was following close behind and had to turn sharply to avoid the wreckage. Men aboard the battleship watched pieces of Hood falling from the sky. Others saw survivors struggling in water cold enough to kill within minutes. Of the 1,421 officers and sailors aboard Hood, only 3 men were rescued: Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. 3 survivors from a crew large enough to fill a small town. The loss remains one of the deadliest single disasters involving a Royal Navy warship during the Second World War. News of Hood's destruction reached Britain within hours. The psychological impact was enormous. This was not an unknown destroyer or merchant vessel. This was Hood. For an entire generation, she had represented the strength of the Royal Navy. Her image had appeared in newspapers, books, advertisements, and children's collections. The possibility that she could be destroyed in a single engagement was difficult enough to comprehend. The fact that she had disappeared in minutes was almost unbelievable. Winston Churchill's response was direct. Bismarck had to be sunk. The Royal Navy mobilized ships across the Atlantic. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and reconnaissance aircraft were redirected into the search. The hunt that followed has become one of the best-known naval pursuits in history. 3 days after Hood disappeared, Bismarck was surrounded and destroyed. There is a grim connection between the two wrecks. Hood's loss created the political and emotional pressure that made Bismarck's escape almost impossible. Once Hood exploded, the German battleship was no longer simply an enemy raider. She had become the most wanted ship in the Atlantic. Yet even after Bismarck was sunk, questions about Hood remained. What exactly had the German shells struck? Had it passed through the deck armor? Had a fire spread downward into the magazines? Could an explosion involving smaller ammunition have triggered the main magazine? Had Hood's structure failed in some other way? The Royal Navy investigated the loss, but there were only 3 survivors, none of whom had been in a position to see what happened deep inside the ship. The wreck lay somewhere in the Denmark Strait, beyond the reach of ordinary divers, and difficult to locate in one of the harshest regions of the North Atlantic. For 60 years, Hood remained missing. Then, in 2001, an expedition led by shipwreck hunter David Mearns located her at a depth of roughly 9,300 feet. The discovery did not reveal an intact warship resting peacefully on the bottom. It revealed a debris field. Hood had broken into multiple major sections. Her bow and stern lay separated, with damaged machinery, armor, hull plating, and other wreckage scattered across the seabed. Some sections were twisted outward, others were crushed or torn apart. The condition of the wreck supported what witnesses had reported in 1941. Hood had suffered an enormous internal explosion, almost certainly involving one of her magazines. This was not a ship that slowly filled with water. The blast destroyed her structural integrity almost instantly. That is one of the most striking differences between Hood and Bismarck. Bismarck lies largely upright and recognizable, her massive hull still appearing like a ship despite the damage and decades underwater. Hood is different. Across much of the site, the shape of the vessel has been lost. Her remains look less like a sunken warship and more like the aftermath of a violent industrial explosion. And among that wreckage are the men who never escaped. HMS Hood is protected as a military maritime grave. The site is governed by British law, and unauthorized interference is prohibited. Explorations have used remotely operated vehicles rather than human divers. The wreck lies far beyond normal diving depth, but technology is not the only reason it has been left undisturbed. Of the 1,421 men who sailed into battle aboard Hood, 1,418 remain with the ship. In 2015, one carefully authorized recovery was made. The ship's bell was raised from the wreck, conserved, and later placed on display at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. The bell serves as a memorial to the crew. Everything else remains below. There is a brutal symmetry to the final chapter of this story. Hood and Bismarck met for only a few minutes, yet their names have remained connected for more than 8 decades. The new German battleship destroyed Britain's most famous warship. Hood's destruction then triggered the pursuit that ended with Bismarck sinking 3 days later. Today, both ships lie in the North Atlantic. Both are protected wreck sites. Both still hold most of the men who died aboard them. But they rest in very different conditions. Bismarck sits on the seabed like the battered remains of a battleship. Hood lies scattered across it, proof of how quickly thousands of tons of steel can be undone by a single shell reaching the right place at exactly the wrong moment. For 21 years, HMS Hood had been treated as the embodiment of British naval power. Her size, speed, guns, history and reputation made her seem almost permanent. Yet the weakness that destroyed her had been discussed for years. The refit had been planned. The danger had been understood. There simply had never been enough time to take the mighty Hood out of service. Then, in the Denmark Strait, time ran out. If you enjoyed this story, let me know which ship you would like me to cover next. There are dozens of wrecks still sitting beneath the world's oceans, and many of them carry stories just as remarkable as Hood's. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and I will see you there.